The main gimmick of Half-Life 2, and one of the great weapons in all of gaming, is the gravity gun. This gun can suck in nearly every typical small object in the game and turn it into a devastating projectile that can take out multiple enemies at once. By the time you get the gravity gun, though, about halfway through Half-Life 2, the player has fought and survived against many of the Combine's forces. Despite the incredible actions that the weapon can pull off, some players might feel like reverting back to their old hit-scan weapons as they worked well before and are probably more efficient when taking out loads of enemies. In order to highlight the destructive potential and overall versatility of the gravity gun, the designers at Valve devised a level that was so entertainingly different in tone and composition from the earlier levels of Half-Life 2 that it has stuck in the minds of players ever since they could get their hands on it back in 2004. All that the player knows about the level beforehand comes from a single quote from Alex Vance a few minutes prior.
That's the old passage to Ravenholm. We don't go there anymore.
Before we dive into Ravenholm, though, it's worth taking a look at some events in the level that precedes it, Black Mesa East, to provide some context for how great the level really is. Though it is largely a story-driven chapter with not much action when compared to other levels in Half-Life 2, Black Mesa East is a critical point in the game, as it's when the player receives arguably the most powerful weapon, and by far the most innovative weapon in the whole game. Dr. Vance refers to the weapon as the zero-point energy field manipulator, but from now on we'll refer to it as the gravity gun for the sake of this script. The gravity gun allows the player to pick up most physics objects in the environment and fling or drop them to kill enemies and solve puzzles. The tutorial for the weapon in Black Mesa East is a brief section where the player plays catch with Alex's robot named Dog, before a swift interruption by the Combine forces ramps up the tension. It is after this point that while running back through the facility, the player is led towards Ravenholm itself. I feel that it is key to include this context because when shown with examples I'll get into now, it really shows how the level of Ravenholm serves as what I would call the true, brilliant tutorial for the gravity gun. Though the tutorial in the previous level acts as a more standard teaching tool found in many games, where an NPC asks you to do one action, then repeat that action, then do another action, and so on, the use of the gravity gun in Ravenholm is heavily implied to the player without directly telling them. In other words, to borrow a term that you've likely heard in your high school English class, this level is a prime example of show, don't tell. The theme of this quote is present before the level even starts, because in order to gain access to Ravenholm, the player is nudged towards using the gravity gun to open a ladder cage, which allows them to progress into Ravenholm proper. The next silent tutorial is presented in the first of Ravenholm's many rundown buildings. The player enters a room full of gas canisters and saw blades, at the end of which is a zombie impaled with a saw blade, and the entrance to another room that is blocked by two more. The player, already armed with the knowledge that they can kill zombies by shooting them in the head from previous levels, is shown through environmental storytelling that zombies can be killed by hitting them with saw blades. Passive observation melds into active gameplay immediately, as once the player grabs one of the two blocking saw blades to move into the next room, a zombie walks into frame at the perfect level to be sawed in half, in the same fashion as the impaled zombie on the wall. Now I don't know about you, but in my opinion that brief sequence is a much more powerful way for game designers to teach the player a concept than if they had simply had another character talk the player through it. Another, albeit less subtle, example of this concept is when the player encounters the first trap in Ravenholm. There are plenty of physics objects around the area to toss at the trap for the player to see that they can't damage it. Once a bit of time has passed, two zombies come from a corridor on the other side of the trap and kill themselves by running into it as they try to get to the player, highlighting the destructive power of the device. These two characteristics, being both destructive and indestructible, primarily teach the player to crouch under the trap to proceed in that moment, but also show how efficient they can be for eliminating zombies when they appear throughout the level as an environmental weapon added to the player's arsenal. By teaching the player both of these concepts at the beginning of the level, they are able to use them to progress as they encounter new challenges. Having the tutorials lead into new encounters reinforces a theme of survival that can be seen throughout the design of Ravenholm. The fact that the characteristics of both the gravity gun and Ravenholm's traps are taught to the player within the first 5 minutes of the level using no NPC dialogue or text boxes is truly remarkable. It's become almost standard in games these days that when a mechanic is to be taught to the player, some words pop up on the screen which state exactly how something works and when it should be used. Because the tutorials for these two mechanics are non-verbal, by utilizing scripted events to teach the player, they are more effective in conveying how they can be manipulated by actively engaging the player while they are learning. The use of the environment of Ravenholm as a part of these tutorials serves to maintain the player's level of immersion in the atmospheric context of the area, which is another factor which makes it so unique among FPS levels. Ravenholm as a level is so atmospherically different to any other level in Half-Life 2 that I wouldn't be surprised if it was jarring to some players when they first entered. As you have seen already, the town itself is densely packed, consisting mostly of tight alleyways and corridors that serve to make the player feel claustrophobic as they progress, a stark contrast to the more open areas of previous levels. The few wider sections that are dotted throughout the level are crawling with headcrabs and zombies that have practically taken over the city. These enemies, along with the environmental art of Ravenholm, are the two primary factors which give the level its horror-inspired aesthetic, making the player feel creeped out and cut off from the rest of the game world. As opposed to all the other levels of the game, there are no Combine soldiers to fight and none of Gordon Freeman's friends to make the player feel at ease, heightening the unsettling nature of the level by placing them in an unfamiliar situation. The first wide-open section that the player encounters contributes to the dark atmosphere of Ravenholm, while also serving as their first meeting with Father Grigori, the only friendly NPC in the level. As the player enters the area, they witness a massive bonfire full of corpses while being greeted by Grigori. There is little time to take in these aspects of the scene, however, as the player soon finds themselves swarmed by zombies coming out of the nearby buildings and within the bonfire itself. The imposing size of the bonfire and the flaming zombies that attack the player are memorable images as they highlight a theme of desperate survival that is not really present in the rest of Half-Life 2. Ravenholm was a hidden town that was found and attacked by Combine forces, and now the only residents are a crazy old man and a bunch of zombies, one of which is captured in a cage and can be burned to death. The sad and creepy tone of the town's backstory is supported by various environmental elements of the level, which begin with this bonfire scene in the town square. More minor atmospheric elements are present within the cramped buildings of Ravenholm, which add to the feeling of gloominess that is present throughout the level. Graffiti written on the walls by the citizens of the town paints a desperate picture of life during the outbreak as they tried to escape. There are tables present in some buildings where dead zombies are laid out on tables that were presumably dying people that were being treated or experimented on and did not survive. The little touches added to the level might not be as apparent to any one player as the massive bonfire or Grigori's traps on an individual level, but when they are combined, they contribute just as much to the tone and world building of the level as the more prominent set-piece features. There are many levels in games which introduce new mechanics for the player to interact with and learn about. In first-person shooters, it is somewhat necessary to add something new and interesting at these intervals to keep the player engaged and prevent the gameplay loop of shooting lots of things from getting repetitive. Half-Life 2 does just this in several of its levels. Sometimes it works more successfully, like the addition of being able to command antlions to attack Combine forces, and sometimes it doesn't, like the game's much maligned vehicle levels. Ravenholm manages to introduce a new mechanic and two new enemy types which serve to change the possible strategies at the player's disposal, keeping the gameplay refreshing. In order to protect himself from the infected citizens, Father Grigori set up a variety of deadly traps around Ravenholm. While some are mainly used to temporarily block the player's progress, like the propane and electric traps, others can be used by the player to thin out the zombie hordes. The first of these are the propeller traps which I talked about earlier. These traps are scattered throughout the level, both inside and outside of buildings, and are usually turned off by default without player intervention. If activated, the propeller traps can kill large groups of zombies practically instantly and save the player both time and ammo while progressing through Ravenholm. These traps are entirely optional for the player to use, but contribute to the atmosphere and amount of player choice in the level simply by their inclusion. Another example, the car traps, have a dual usage in that they can be used to crush zombies as well as being necessary for the player to progress as they walk across the cars to travel along the rooftops of the town. The Ravenholm traps are one of the few instances in Half-Life 2 where players are able to use the environment around them to their advantage to dispatch enemies, rather than just a weapon in their selection menu. Their addition to the level breaks up portions where shooting enemies is the only reasonable defense, and allows resourceful players to bend the surroundings of the level to their advantage and reserve their supplies for future encounters. Due to it being the center of a massive headcrab infestation, Ravenholm is the ideal level to introduce new subtypes of the common headcrab enemy found in previous levels. As such, 2 new versions of the typical headcrab and their zombie counterparts are present in Ravenholm, the fast headcrab and the poison headcrab. Both variants serve to overwhelm the player within the level's tight corridors when compared to most other enemies which can be comfortably shot from a distance. The fast head crab is the simpler of the two, and that its only difference from the normal head crab is that it can close distance faster, requiring faster twitch skills on the part of the player. When paired with a human form, these head crabs make the typical lumbering zombie much more dangerous. When controlled by a fast head crab, zombies take on many of the fast head crab's characteristics, like being able to jump and climb, while being more agile in general, and usually traveling in packs. These zombies not only require more precise shooting skills on the part of the player, they also force the player to stay alert throughout Ravenholm, as even on the rooftops that initially seem safe, there could be a fast zombie around the corner. Their unpredictable movement gives the zombie the ability to startle the player and make them feel uneasy by rapidly attacking from out of sight and surprising them, reinforcing the theme of horror present in the level. On the other hand, the poison head crab has the potential to be highly deadly with one simple hit, as its venom attacks reduce the player to 1 health before slowly regaining their lost health through an automatically administered anti-venom. The highly dangerous nature of this attack makes killing the poison head crabs a priority in situations with many enemies around, as being hit by a poison head crab can leave the player vulnerable to a one-hit death from any other enemy type. In a similar fashion to the speed of the fast head crab, the damage of this enemy variant can surprise the player and compromise their usual strategies. Their deadliness only multiplies when attached to a host, as a poison zombie has 3 times as much health as a normal zombie and will fling up to 3 poison head crabs at the player if they are not killed fast enough. The effect of these 2 enemies and their zombie variants in combination with the unsettling atmosphere of Ravenholm's artistic design serve to keep the player on edge in terms of gameplay as well as immersion more generally. The shadowy, claustrophobic tone of Ravenholm is enough on its own to distinguish itself from the typical well-lit and open levels of most first-person shooters. What makes Ravenholm truly special, though, is how this tone is reinforced through artistic and mechanical choices by the developers to engage the player while delivering a story through its environmental design. As the player travels through the town, into the graveyard, and further down into the mines, they are introduced to a helpful NPC and his variety of traps, 2 new enemy types, and the most iconic weapon of the Half-Life series, all while never feeling overwhelming in terms of pacing. Ravenholm is an area that is a fantastic vertical slice of game design that can be analyzed from many different angles, from how to teach the player a mechanic to how to make them feel a certain way. Because it is successful in employing so many concepts that all contribute to the main themes of the level, there is no doubt in my mind that Ravenholm is one of the greatest FPS levels of all time.